So today's video is going to focus on the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. We're going to do both topics 1.5 and 3.4. So you can use this to study for future tests or get yourself ready for projects so that you are able to do well on those. So these are the objectives. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can kind of use these to study. If you know this stuff from both your reading and from what we do in class, you're going to do pretty well on quizzes and tests. Here's the vocab. I'm not going to go through each one by itself because you should be getting this from your reading, but some you should definitely know and focus on are heliocentric, the scientific method, and empiricism. Those are going to come back up. 3.4 has a lot more vocab. This is probably some of the most important vocab you're going to learn the entire year because you're going to use it throughout our class, but also in U.S. history. You want to focus on natural law, social contract, natural rights, laissez-faire, free market, and censorship. Those are going to be really important ones for you to know. So we're going to start with the scientific revolution that starts in the late 1500s and runs to the 1700s. So before the scientific revolution, Europe focused on the teachings of the ancient Greeks and Romans, specifically Ptolemy and Aristotle, and that's going to be called Aristotelianism. And it's going to focus on the idea that truth comes from reason, just sitting around thinking about something, and divine revelation, like God or gods giving you the answer to something you were searching for. It's not focused on science how we think of it. This is partly because they just didn't have the tools that we had, but they also hadn't thought of the ideas that we're going to see in later slides. The teachings of the church are extremely powerful. And when I say the church, there is a specific church. It is the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is going to control science for a long time. It's going to be illegal to even dissect a body. They're going to fight certain discoveries made in astronomy, and they're going to be actually the most powerful thing in Europe for many, many years, even above the kings and queens of the nations that actually rule their people. So what changes is first the Renaissance, and that's just the idea that it's kind of the rebirth of science and art in Europe after what we would call the Dark Ages. So there's a focus on rational thought and inquiry, thinking about things and investigating it. The discovery of the New World where you live today, the discovery of the Americas, it kind of blows up a lot of the thoughts and ideas about the world because suddenly there's two new continents that just are discovered. There's new animals, plants, people, all kinds of things that kind of spark this interest in science. And the printing press. With the development of the printing press, books become cheaper and more available, so naturally education rises and people begin thinking of new things in new ways. The second thing is the Reformation, and this is the Reformation of the Catholic Church. It leads to the Protestant Church. It encourages the questioning of the Catholic Church and tradition. People say, well, why is it always done like this? Can it be done a different way? And these kind of combine to make a lot of problems. There's going to be wars, there's going to be nations broken apart, but it also leads to this rebirth in science and philosophy. So the philosophers challenge what we called that Aristotelian worldview, okay? And they replace it with empiricism. So empiricism is what we call mechanical philosophers. They believe that everything works on like fixed mechanics. So you see that diagram down here of the eyes. The eyes, they say, are basically just a machine that the human body uses to see. Everything can be broken down into its parts. The universe runs on laws. If you hit something, it's naturally going to move. They think that there's laws to everything and you can use science to figure things out. So the first guy to really challenge it will be this guy down here with his wonderful haircut, Nicholas Copernicus. And he proposes the idea of heliocentrism. And this challenges Ptolemy's original idea of geocentrism. So in heliocentrism, the idea is helio, meaning sun. The sun is the center of the universe. whereas in geocentrism, the Earth is the center of the universe. And this is a brand new idea. A lot of people for a long time had thought that the Earth was the center and all the planets and the sun orbited around it. But he challenges this idea, and it kind of shows that Earth isn't as important as people think. Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, they go on to make mathematic equations that prove heliocentrism. Eventually, Galileo Galilei builds a new telescope that then proves it even further. But the church challenges these discoveries. Remember, the Catholic Church does not want those challenges to tradition. They challenge those discoveries, but eventually, because of the printing press, because of this new interest in science, kings and queens getting interested in it, these ideas begin to spread, and they further erode the power of the church and the power of tradition. Francis Bacon, not to be confused with the actor, he's an English philosopher, and he believes in this idea that methods provide proof. This is the beginning of the modern scientific method. So he says that you have to observe something, analyze it, and interact with it, and then you're better going to understand it. So if you're doing an experiment, you can't just sit there and think about how the experiment would go. You actually have to go out and do the experiment. He develops the idea of empiricism. This is the beginning of our modern way of experimenting that you use in science class. Along with him is Rene Descartes. He's French. And he says you have to doubt all previous ideas. You have to doubt everything until it is actually proven. So you want to, even like a simple thing like the wind, you want to doubt that there is such a thing as wind until you can prove what it actually is. And he has a slightly different approach from Bacon. He says that science has to be investigated, demonstrated, and repeatable. And if you combine their two ideas, you get our modern scientific method. You have to be able to repeat the experiment a couple times to prove that it's actually true. He had this famous quote that said, "I think, therefore I am." So he was kind of going with his whole idea of science. He was thinking about something, experimenting with it, and therefore he knew that it was true. That led to the scientific method that you use in science of observing something, creating a hypothesis about it, experimenting, analyzing the experiment, seeing if it supports your hypothesis, and then usually it leads to a new hypothesis. And it's kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill in Europe. Every new experiment that some guy does, every new discovery that someone has leads to another new question, leads to another new invention, which leads to another new idea. And eventually it creates this explosion of science in Europe. Isaac Newton, we have to mention him. He's English. He develops the theory of gravity. And his idea, it kind of goes along with Bacon and Descartes, that the universe is a clock, and it can be explained through math. So all the math that you're going to do when you get to be a senior, like calculus, you can thank Sir Isaac Newton over here for that. So the scientific method is very, very important. And the impact of the scientific revolution is obviously going to be the scientific method comes out of it. This is going to be that springboard for Europe having a lot of scientific discoveries and engineering discoveries. The challenging between the people and the church and the government is going to be a major, major issue. It's going to challenge those old ideas and teachings that like kings used to make it so they were 100% in charge. But it's also going to lead to the Enlightenment. A lot of people are no longer going to accept the old ways of government. They're going to use the scientific method almost to try and come up with new ways of government. And that's why I put this painting of the American Revolution, because the American Revolution is essentially taking the scientific revolution and applying it to government. So they're going to have a theory, a prediction, experiment, and observe. And they're going to see if that government works. So that's going to lead us now into the Enlightenment, which is going to be our main focus. So before the Enlightenment, the idea of the right of government. So when we say the right to government, what we mean is who has the right to rule people. The old idea is called divine right, that a monarch is chosen by God You can see in this painting, here's the monarch, the king or queen is chosen by God, and they are the ones who rule. So you should listen to them because God chose them. And they use the Catholic Church to justify that. The king wasn't crowned by the people. The king was crowned by the Pope, and the Pope spoke for God. So who is in charge? The king, because God said so. But the new idea is going to be in the Enlightenment that power comes from the people, the consent of the governed. So the idea is that you give the government the power by giving consent. You say that you can rule over me. And you do this by voting, electing officials, paying taxes, serving in the military. You say this government is my government. You also have individual rights. You have rights that cannot be taken away. We'll go over that in a little bit. And secular government. During the Enlightenment, people have the radical idea to begin separating religion and government. They don't want the church in their government, and they don't want their government in the church. They want them totally separate. Secular, whenever we see this, just means non-religious. So if you see something that says like secular music, that means non-religious music. So the state of nature, these are our ideas. They're also vocab words, but these are our big ideas that come out of the Enlightenment. So the first one is the state of nature, and this is a theoretical idea where there is no government. So think of it like it's a free-for-all. People are cavemen. There's no rules. It's just totally crazy. And it's used to speculate on human nature, like what would we do? So you kind of have to think to yourself, if there were no rules and no laws, what do you think people would be like? Would they be good and they naturally would work together? Or would they be bad and kill each other and take from each other? And what this does is it helps answer questions about why do we do what we do as people? And why should we have to follow laws? If you think people are naturally good, your government is going to look different than a government where you think people are naturally bad. Natural laws are the unchanging principles of how humans act. So this goes back to the idea of, do you think people are naturally good, or do you think people are naturally bad? And that's going to influence how you see a state of nature. Natural rights. This is the one you need to star and you need to know. So natural rights are rights, the idea that all humans have rights from birth. They come from God and they cannot be taken away, period. Everybody has them. So this would be like the United States saying everybody has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No one can take that away from you because when you're born, you just have those rights. And then finally, the social contract. This is the most complicated idea. So in a social contract, this is an agreement where people give up freedom. So imagine you're in the state of nature. Everything's crazy. People are killing each other. They're stealing from each other, and nobody can stop it. You would make an agreement with your neighbors to give up your freedoms to steal and take things and kill other people, to live in a society with laws so other people couldn't hurt and steal from you. There's going to be differing opinions on why we do that. We'll go over that. And the idea is if it's broken, people can overthrow the government. So the social contract, it's not a real thing. It's all theoretical. And it's going to be an agreement between people to make a government. And if the government suddenly breaks that social contract, they can be overthrown. So this is the idea for the social contract. The people want to live in a society where they're safe. So they make a social contract with their government to protect their rights. So you give up your power. Let's say you give up your power to steal things. So people can't steal your things. So you give up your power to steal things. That means people can't steal from you. And that's a good idea. But what happens if the government suddenly starts stealing your stuff? They just come into your house and they take it. Well, then you have a right to overthrow the government because the government broke the social contract with you. And then you make a new social contract with a new government. So our big ideas, our big philosophers, we'll go over these more. We'll review them. But you're going to have natural rights, the idea of life, liberty, and property. And this is going to come from a guy named John Locke. And it's in the U.S. Declaration of Independence under idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are your natural rights. No one can take them away. We have the separation of powers. If you look at this picture over here, that government should be broken up into different branches. These guys make the laws. This guy executes the laws and enforces them. And then the judicial branches enforces the laws and makes sure that they're interpreted correctly. If you have one person doing all these things, what they say goes. But now the people have a say in each of these. It's broken up so nobody gets too much power. That's going to come from Baron de Montesquieu. And in the United States, that's going to be our three branches of government we have. We're going to have religious freedom and thought and expression. Think of the Bill of Rights. You have a right, you have freedom of speech, freedom of press. You have freedom of worship. That's going to come from a guy called Voltaire in France. And it's also going to be included in both the US and French constitutions. So the big connections to the scientific revolution are going to be people ask why things are the way they are. They say, well, why do we just follow the king? Why don't we elect our officials? There's going to be more secular beliefs. You're going to have freedom of religion, okay? There's no longer divine right. The king doesn't rule just because God said so. The king rules because the people are allowing him to rule. This goes back to that idea of the social contract. And also the importance of the individual rights. You have rights that the government cannot take away and that are given naturally to you. It's not just everything is in God's hands. People kind of make their own lives. That's going to be the big thing about the Enlightenment. People decide what their government is going to be. So I hope that that's kind of a good intro to the Enlightenment. If you're watching this at home, we're going to review this in class. We're going to go over it real quick. I just want to make sure that you have the notes down before we go over it. If you have any questions, let me know and I'll be more than happy to answer them.